metal grated against her spine. Fingers like iron bands crushed her windpipe. The chemical stench of the air filtration core burned her nostrils, but it was the metallic tang of her own blood that choked her. Rin clawed blindly at the massive hand lifting her off the grated floor. Chapter 1. Vex smiled. The executioner captain leaned closer. His breath smelled of stale meat and ozone. "Speak, little rat," Vex whispered. Rin kicked her booted feet. Her worn soles scraped uselessly against the rusted ventilation pipes. She couldn't breathe. Black spots danced at the edge of her vision, blending with the flickering magenta neon lights of Neo Viridia's deepest sector. "Did you steal the filtration core?" Vex demanded. His claws pricked the delicate skin of her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut. She had stolen nothing. She was just a cleaner, a shadow scraping toxic sludge from the underground kingdom's mechanical veins. But she couldn't tell him that. She had sworn an oath of silence the night her family's blood painted the palace marble. A vow carved into her own throat with a jagged blade to ensure she would never slip, never reveal the lost princess hiding beneath the grime. Vex tightened his grip. Her lungs burned. The pressure in her skull pounded a frantic, deafening rhythm. "Scream for me," Vex sneered. "Make a sound or I break your neck." Rin's hands fell limply to her sides. She would die here. She would die in the dark, surrounded by the hum of the subterranean generators, suffocated by a brute who didn't even know he was executing the last heir to the throne. Then, the air pressure changed. The ambient temperature plummeted. The hairs on Rin's arms stood on end. A low, vibrating rumble echoed through the metallic cavern. It wasn't the machinery. It was a sound born of pure, primal violence. It rattled the bolts in the steel grating. It vibrated in the marrow of Rin's bones. Alpha dominance. Vex froze. His cruel smile vanished. Let her go. The voice was a lethal weapon. It was deep, scraping like gravel over steel, dripping with a lethal calm that promised immediate devastation. Vex's fingers spasmed. He dropped her. Rin collapsed onto the metal grating. She gasped, pulling the metallic, ozone-heavy air into her burning lungs. She scrambled backward, her hands sliding in the toxic sludge she had been scrubbing minutes prior. She pressed her back against the cold, vibrating pipe, coughing silently. Heavy boots stepped into the flickering neon light. King Dax, the usurper, the tyrant of Neo Viridia, the wolf who ruled the underground dystopia with a fist soaked in blood. He was massive. His broad shoulders blocked out the distant glow of the city sector. He wore a dark tactical combat jacket, the collar turned up against the chill of the lower levels. His dark hair was disheveled, and his eyes, a terrifying, luminous amber, swept over the scene. Those eyes landed on Vex. The executioner captain dropped to one knee. His submission was instant and absolute. "My king," Vex stammered. The scent of his sudden terror soured the air, reeking of burnt copper. This scavenger was caught in the restricted zone. I was interrogating her. Dax did not look at Vex. His glowing amber gaze slid past the captain. It locked onto Rin. She stopped breathing. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She lowered her head, hiding her face behind a curtain of greasy, matted hair. She made herself small, invisible, just a piece of trash in the underground gutters. Dax took a step forward. Vex visibly flinched, assuming the movement was for him. "She refused to speak, sire. She is defiant. I will dispose of her immediately." "Silence." Dax's command was not loud. It didn't need to be. The sheer force of his aura forced Vex to bow his head until his forehead touched the grimy metal floor. Dax bypassed the captain entirely. He stopped directly in front of Rin. His combat boots, polished despite the filth of the sector, rested inches from her bruised knees. The scent of him washed over her. It was overwhelming. Crushed pine, dark earth, and a dangerous electric crackle of ozone. It was the scent of a predator at the top of the food chain. Rin kept her eyes glued to his boots. She trembled. Slowly, Dax crouched down. The leather of his jacket creaked. The movement was deliberately slow, predatory but restrained. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice was a low vibration that demanded absolute obedience. Rin's wolf, the dormant, terrified creature buried deep inside her, whimpered in submission. She had no choice. She slowly lifted her chin. Her eyes met his. Dax went perfectly still. His pupils dilated, swallowing the amber irises until they were almost entirely black. A sharp, ragged inhale tore from his chest. For a fraction of a second, the tyrant looked vulnerable, stricken. Rin saw his large hand twitch. It was a well-known fact across Neo-Viridia. The Alpha King was deeply, incurably touch-starved, a psychological affliction born of his violent ascent to power. He could not bear the physical contact of another living soul. To touch the king was to invite instant death. His skin rejected connection, perceiving all touch as a threat, inducing a violent, nauseating revulsion. Yet his hand moved toward her. Rin shrank back against the pipe. Dax's hand paused in the air. It was a large hand, wrapped in black tactical bandages, the exposed knuckles heavily scarred. He did not retreat. He leaned closer. His chest rose and fell in heavy, rhythmic breaths. He was scenting her. Rin's blood ran cold. She smelled of chemical sludge, sweat, and cheap, synthetic soap. But beneath that, buried under years of grime and fear, was the faint, sweet scent of her true lineage. Did he recognize it? Did he smell the bloodline he had sworn to eradicate? Dax's jaw clenched. A low, vibrating growl rumbled in his chest. It was not a growl of anger. It was a sound of profound, agonizing relief. His scarred fingers breached the final distance. Rin squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the killing blow. Instead, she felt the agonizingly gentle brush of his calloused fingertips against her throat. He touched the fresh, bleeding puncture wounds left by Vex's claws. Then his thumb grazed the thick, jagged scar that slashed across her vocal cords. The self-inflicted wound that kept her silent. A jolt of pure electricity shot through Rin's body. Dax let out a ragged exhale. His thumb stroked her scar again, reverence bleeding through his touch. The monster of Neo-Viridia was touching a gutter rat, and he was not recoiling. He was leaning in, his body craving the connection, his wolf howling in sudden violent awakening. He was obsessed, instantly, dangerously. "My king," Vex dared to whisper from his prostrate position. "She is toxic, a lower-level scavenger. Please step away from the filth." Dax's hand remained on Rin's neck. His thumb rested securely against her racing pulse. He slowly turned his head to look at Vex. The air pressure in the room snapped. Dax moved faster than the human eye could track. In a blur of motion, he crossed the space, his boots slamming into Vex's chest. The impact sounded like a cannon shot. Vex flew backward, crashing into the steel filtration tanks with bone-shattering force. The captain crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, ribs visibly caved in. Dax stood over him, a demon wrapped in shadows. "You touched her," Dax said softly. The quietness of his voice was far more terrifying than a roar. Vex coughed up blood, his eyes wide with unadulterated horror. I was protecting the sector." Dax turned his back on the broken captain. He walked back to Rin. She watched him approach, her breath catching in her ruined throat. She was trapped. She had survived the executioner, only to fall into the hands of the tyrant himself. Dax crouched before her again. Without a word, he slid one massive arm under her knees and the other behind her back. Rin panicked. She shoved her hands against his chest, pushing with all her meager strength. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a broken, breathy hiss escaped her scarred throat. Dax ignored her resistance. He gathered her into his arms and stood, lifting her effortlessly against his broad chest. His body heat was a furnace against her damp, shivering frame. He held her tightly, burying his nose into the dirty crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, a shudder running through his massive frame. Around them, a dozen royal guards rushed into the sector, weapons drawn, summoned by the sound of the impact. They stopped, dead in their tracks. Their weapons lowered slowly. Shock painted their hardened faces. The untouchable king, the man who ordered executions for a brush shoulder. He was holding a filthy, bleeding scavenger against his heart, as if she were a lifeline. Dax looked up at his stunned guards. His amber eyes burned with a feral, possessive fire. "Her life is mine," Dax declared, his voice echoing through the metallic cavern. "From this breath until her last." He tightened his grip on Rin's trembling body. "Look at her," the Alpha King commanded, his voice dripping with lethal promise. "And I take your eyes." Chapter 2. The elevator ascended with a sickening high-speed lurch. Rin squeezed her eyes shut against the blinding, sterile light of the royal spire. Her throat throbbed with a vicious, rhythmic ache. The air inside the glass box smelled of rain, polished obsidian, and the overwhelming, suffocating scent of the Alpha King. He still held her. His broad chest rose and fell in a steady, hypnotic rhythm beneath her cheek. Rin kept her body completely rigid, terrified that a single twitch would remind the monster he was holding a scavenger. She was a rat in the eagle's nest, bleeding and covered in toxic sludge, pressed against a jacket worth more than her entire sector. The metallic doors chimed. They parted to reveal a sprawling penthouse wrapped in floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass. Black marble floors gleamed like dark ice under the muted glow of recessed neon lighting. Beyond the glass, the neon-soaked smog of Neo-Viridia churned in the deep subterranean cavern. Dax strode through the massive space without a single word. He carried her into a cavernous bathroom bathed in heavy shadows and thick, warm steam. He stopped beside a sunken obsidian tub. Slowly he loosened his iron grip. Rin's boots hit the heated slate floor. Her knees immediately buckled. Dax caught her by the waist. His massive hands spanned her ribs, his thumbs pressing against the fragile span of her stomach. A violent shudder ripped through his massive frame at the contact. The touch-starved king flinched, his jaw locking tight as his wolf battled the instinct to recoil and the desperate, maddening urge to pull her closer. "Stand," he commanded. His voice was a gravelly scrape against the silent room. Rin locked her joints, forcing herself upright. She swayed, her lungs burning as she sucked in the steam-heavy air. Dax stepped back. His chest heaved as if he had just run 100 miles. His glowing amber eyes swept over her filthy, sludge-soaked uniform, his nostrils flaring. "Wash," he ordered, gesturing to the running water. "Burn those rags. You serve only me now." He turned on his heel. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him. The lock engaged with a heavy, final thud. Rin was completely trapped. The hot water scalded her pale skin. It washed away the chemical burn of the lower levels, but it couldn't scrub away the phantom pressure of Vex's claws. Rin stood before the fogged mirror, trembling. She was wrapped in a black silk shirt she had found folded on the vanity. It was massive, falling to her mid-thigh, and it smelled overwhelmingly of Dax. Crushed pine and dangerous ozone wrapped around her senses, confusing her dormant wolf. She touched her throat. The jagged scar was a pale, ugly slash against her skin, bordered by fresh, angry purple bruises from the executioner's grip. She had to escape. If Dax kept her here, he would eventually realize she was not just a mute cleaner. He would smell the royal bloodline beneath the scent of cheap soap. Rin crept toward the heavy door. She pressed her ear against the dark wood, listening for the heavy tread of the king's boots. Absolute silence. She wrapped her trembling fingers around the brass handle and pulled. It didn't budge. It opens from the outside. Rin spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Dax stood in the archway of a secondary door she hadn't noticed, leaning casually against the frame. He had shed his tactical jacket. A simple black T-shirt stretched across his heavily muscled chest, revealing arms corded with thick veins and pale silver scars. He stepped into the bathroom. The ambient temperature spiked immediately. The sheer density of his aura pressed down on her lungs, forcing the air from her chest. Rin backed away. Her bare feet slipped on the slate. Her spine hit the cold glass of the shower enclosure. Dax closed the distance in 3 long strides. He boxed her in, his large hands planted on the glass on either side of her head, caging her. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. His hot breath ghosted over her ear, sending a violent shiver down her spine. "Why do you tremble?" he murmured. Rin clamped her jaw shut. She stared hard at the hollow of his throat, refusing to meet his predatory gaze. Her body shook with a mixture of pure terror and an unwanted, instinctual pull toward his dominant heat. Dax shifted closer. His chest brushed against hers. The contact made him groan, a low rumbling sound of pure agony and desperate need. He lifted a scarred hand. Rin flinched, squeezing her eyes shut. But his touch was painfully gentle. His calloused fingers held a small tin of cooling salve. He scooped a fragrant, mint-scented ointment and pressed it to her bruised throat. The pain vanished instantly, replaced by the electric shock of his skin against hers. "I could shatter this city to dust," Dax whispered, his thumb lingering over her old, jagged scar. "I could kill every soul in that sector for touching you. Just make a sound, a whisper. Let me know you exist in there." Rin's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The desperate plea in the tyrant's voice terrified her more than his anger ever could. A sharp, static crackle broke the heavy silence. The comms unit on Dax's wrist blinked with a harsh, pulsing red light. Dax went rigid. His amber eyes flashed with sudden lethal irritation. He stepped back, tearing his hand away from her skin as if he had been burned. He tapped the device. "Speak." Vex's voice filtered through the tiny speaker, raspy and labored from his crushed ribs. "My king." The scanners in the lower levels. They picked up an anomaly. Rin stopped breathing. "Get to the point, Vex," Dax snarled, his eyes never leaving Rin's face. "It's genetic residue, sire," Vex wheezed, coughing wetly into the comms. "Ancient blood. The old royal line. It triggered the dormant wards. The signature, it's moving upward. It's inside the central spire." Ice flooded Rin's veins. The scanners had caught her blood when Vex cut her throat. They knew. The usurper's executioner was hunting a ghost, and the ghost was standing in the king's own bathroom. Dax's jaw clenched. "Lock down the spire. No one enters, no one leaves. If the dead wish to walk in my tower, I will bury them myself." He cut the connection. The momentary distraction was all Rin needed. She lunged. She ducked under his massive arm, her bare feet slapping against the marble as she bolted for the main door, Her lungs burned. Her wolf screamed at her to run, to hide, to survive. She didn't make it 3 steps. An iron grip clamped around her waist. Dax hauled her backward, lifting her off her feet entirely. Rin thrashed in his hold. She kicked, her elbows flying backward, striking solid muscle that felt like a brick wall. "Stop!" Dax's command vibrated through her bones. He didn't hurt her. He simply absorbed her frantic blows, wrapping his massive arms around her completely until she was immobilized against his chest. He buried his face in her wet hair, inhaling deeply, his wolf aggressively scenting his new prize. "You are not leaving," he growled against her scalp, his voice dark with possessive finality. "The world outside will kill you. Here, you are mine." The violent struggle drained the last of Rin's adrenaline. Her body went completely limp. The heavy, oppressive dominance in Dax's scent acted like a narcotic, forcing her exhausted muscles to yield. She couldn't fight a fully shifted Alpha King. Not tonight. Dax carried her out of the bathroom and into the center of the penthouse. He laid her down on a massive bed, draped in dark, heavy furs. Rin turned her face into the silk pillows. She squeezed her eyes shut, keeping her breathing shallow and even. She had to pretend to sleep. She had to wait for him to leave so she could find a weapon, a vent, a way out of this gilded cage. The mattress dipped. Dax sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't speak. He just watched her. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken obsession and a terrifying, fragile peace. Slowly, Dax reached out. Rin felt the radiating heat of his hand hovering over her back. He pushed the damp curtain of her hair aside, exposing the delicate nape of her neck to the cool air of the room. Her blood turned to lead. Hidden beneath the grime she had failed to wash away, right at the base of her hairline, was the mark. The faded, magical tattoo of a crescent moon pierced by a sword. The undeniable crest of the slaughtered royal family. The very bloodline Vex had just reported. Dax's roughened fingertips brushed against the sensitive skin at the base of her skull. He traced the outline of the scar tissue. Suddenly, his fingers went perfectly still. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted. The scent of crushed pine soured into something sharp, volatile, and dangerously violent. A low, terrifying rumble began deep within Dax's chest, shaking the heavy timber of the bed frame. "No," Dax breathed. The word was a shattered exhale of disbelief. It was followed instantly by a surge of rising feral madness. It can't be. Chapter 3. The silence in the room became a physical weight. Dax's roughened fingertips lingered on the faded crescent moon tattoo at the base of Rin's neck, the mark of the fallen dynasty, the bloodline he had personally eradicated in fire and ash to take the throne of Neo-Viridia. The air pressure in the sprawling penthouse dropped, turning heavy and suffocating. Rin squeezed her eyes shut. Her chest stopped moving. She waited for the killing blow. She waited for the tyrant's heavy hand to snap her fragile neck, extinguishing the last spark of the old royal family. She braced her muscles against the silk sheets, ready for the agonizing end. It didn't come. Instead, Dax's massive frame shuddered violently. He collapsed forward, his broad chest caving as if struck by a physical blow. He buried his face into the warm, damp curve of her neck. He didn't bite. He didn't strike. He inhaled her scent with a desperate, starving aggression, his nose tracing the delicate line of her collarbone. A low, vibrating whine tore from his throat. It was not a sound of royal fury. It was a sound of profound, agonizing desperation. "Hide," he whispered against her skin. The word was jagged, torn from the deepest part of his chest. His calloused hands gripped the heavy silk sheets on either side of her shoulders, caging her entirely, yet meticulously refusing to crush her. His body heat was a furnace, radiating a heavy, oppressive dominance that made Rin's dormant wolf whimper in absolute submission. He was protecting her. The ruthless usurper who had burned her family's banners was suddenly, inexplicably, willing to burn his own kingdom to keep her a secret. A sharp static crackle shattered the heavy tension. The comms unit on Dax's wrist pulsed with a harsh, glaring red light. Dax went completely rigid. His amber eyes, burning with a feral, possessive fire, snapped open. He lifted his head slowly, the muscles in his jaw ticking with lethal irritation. "Speak," Dax snarled into the device, his voice dropping to a dangerous, gravelly register. "My king," Vex's voice echoed, metallic, wheezing, and deeply suspicious. "The genetic trail from the lower levels. It leads directly to the royal spire. The ancient wards are screaming. I am assembling the elite execution squad. We will breach the floors." The ambient temperature in the bedroom plummeted to freezing. Dax's eyes darkened, the amber bleeding into a terrifying, bottomless black. "Cancel the squad," Dax commanded, his tone dripping with quiet, murderous promise. "The spire is locked. No one enters. If I see a single soldier on this floor, I will personally rip their spine from their body." "But sire, the law requires—" Dax crushed the comms unit in his fist. Sparks showered onto the dark marble floor as the device shattered into useless pieces. He looked down at Rin. The feral hunger in his gaze warred with a terrifying, agonizing restraint. He leaned down, hovering just an inch above her face. Rin held her breath, trapped beneath the sheer density of his aura. "Do not move," he commanded softly, his hot breath ghosting over her trembling lips. "Do not make a sound." He pulled away, though the physical separation seemed to cause him genuine agony. He turned his back on her, his broad shoulders tight with coiled violence. The heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind him. The electronic locks engaged with a heavy, final thud. Rin was completely alone. She sat up instantly, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She had to run. Vex was not a fool. The executioner captain would never ignore a direct threat to the throne, not even on the orders of his own king. She threw her legs over the edge of the massive bed. Her bare feet hit the cold, polished obsidian floor. She ignored the throbbing ache in her bruised throat and ran toward the reinforced glass windows. The neon-soaked smog of Neo-Viridia churned thousands of feet below, a dizzying drop into the toxic abyss. There was no escape through the glass. The shadows in the far corner of the room shifted. Rin froze. The scent of stale blood and burnt copper hit her senses a second too late. The heavy ventilation grate above the massive armoire had been silently removed. Vex dropped to the floor. His ribs were tightly bound beneath his tactical vest. His face was pale, contorted with pain from Dax's earlier blow, but his eyes burned with fanatical, lethal clarity. In his right hand, a long, serrated silver blade caught the magenta neon light filtering through the glass. "I knew it," Vex hissed, spitting a glob of dark blood onto the pristine marble. He stepped forward. Rin scrambled backward, her bare feet slipping on the slick floor. "The king loses his mind over a filthy scavenger," Vex sneered, his gaze locking onto the exposed nape of her neck. And suddenly, the royal alarms trigger. He is blinded by his sickness, but I am not. I know what you are. Rin backed into the heavy mahogany dresser. She opened her mouth to scream, but only a broken, breathy rasp escaped her ruined vocal cords. Her silence was her prison. Vex lunged, He was terrifyingly fast, driven by the absolute certainty of his brutal duty. Rin rolled, diving toward the center of the room. The silver blade slashed through the air, tearing a deep gash into the heavy mahogany wood where she had stood a second before. She fell hard onto the floor, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. Pain shot up her arm, but she didn't have time to recover. Vex was upon her. He grabbed a handful of her damp hair, yanking her head back with bone-snapping force. Rin thrashed wildly, her nails clawing at his armored forearm, but he was too strong. The cold, jagged steel of his blade pressed firmly against her collarbone, slicing through the oversized silk shirt. "You belong in the dirt with your father," Vex snarled, raising the blade for the killing strike. The heavy bedroom doors exploded inward. Thick oak splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The reinforced metallic locking mechanism shattered completely, raining down on the dark floor like shrapnel. Dax stood in the ruined doorway. He was no longer entirely human. His bones popped and cracked sickeningly under his skin. His muscles expanded, tearing the fabric of his black shirt as the massive feral wolf fought to break free. His hands had morphed into lethal razor-sharp claws. His eyes were not amber. They were glowing, blood-red pools of pure massacre. Vex froze. His blade slipped, digging a shallow, bloody line into Rin's shoulder. "She is royal remnant," Vex screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and unyielding defiance. "The law requires you to kill her, sire. She is the enemy." Dax did not look at Vex. The Alpha King's glowing red eyes dropped to the thin line of fresh, crimson blood trailing down Rin's pale skin. The sweet, undeniable scent of her pain hit the air, mixing with the heavy ozone of the room. The world stopped. A monstrous, deafening roar tore from Dax's chest. It was the sound of a predator fully unhinged. It was the sound of an empire collapsing. Chapter 4. The roar shattered the remaining glass fixtures in the penthouse. Rin clamped her trembling hands over her ears. The deafening sound vibrated through the floorboards, rattling her teeth and vibrating deep within her chest. Vex scrambled backward, his silver blade clattering uselessly against the dark marble. The executioner's eyes were wide with primal, unadulterated terror. He pressed his back against the wall, clutching his bleeding ribs as he stared up at his king. The massive black-furred beast before him did not look like a ruler. It looked like an ancient god of war, summoned from the darkest depths of the underground to deliver absolute ruin. Heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed from the corridor outside. The royal alarms blared. A pulsing crimson light washed over the ruined doorway in frantic, blinding intervals. Dozens of elite guards swarmed into the hall, their heavy tactical armor gleaming under the emergency neon strobes. Behind the vanguard stood the Council of Neo-Viridia. 4 elderly wolves draped in heavy ceremonial coats, their faces pale with shock and outrage. They stared at the splintered oak, the shattered electronic locks, and the massive, snarling monster blocking the entrance to the royal chambers. The ambient air grew impossibly thin. Rin struggled to pull oxygen into her burning lungs. The sheer density of Dax's feral aura pressed down on the entire floor, forcing several of the front-line guards to drop to their knees in involuntary submission. The sheer heat radiating from his massive body felt like an open furnace. "Alpha!" Elder Silas shouted over the blaring rhythmic sirens. The old wolf's voice trembled slightly, betraying his deep instinctual fear. "Captain Vex has triggered the royal purge mandate. The girl in that room carries the forbidden bloodline. She is a remnant of the old regime. She must be executed immediately for the safety of the realm." The warwolf did not negotiate. Dax lowered his massive, terrifying head. A low, vibrating growl rumbled deep in his chest, shaking the dust from the ceiling tiles and making the floor visibly vibrate. He planted his giant razor-sharp claws into the marble floor, completely shielding Rin from the council's line of sight. The scent of ozone and burnt copper thickened into a suffocating, toxic cloud. He was not going to step aside for his own men. He was going to slaughter them all. Rin stared at his broad, heavily muscled back, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. "Take the girl," Silas commanded. The elder stepped safely behind the fortified line of elite guards. "Subdue the Alpha if you must. Use the silver restraints." The vanguard charged forward with weapons drawn. It was a fatal, catastrophic mistake. Dax moved with terrifying, blinding speed that defied his massive size. He did not shift back to his human form to reason with them. He met the charging soldiers as a nightmare of teeth, muscle, and shadow. Silver chains flew through the air, attempting to bind his massive limbs. Dax snapped the heavy metal links effortlessly. He swiped a giant clawed paw, sending 3 heavily armored guards flying across the wide corridor. They crashed into the reinforced stone walls with bone-shattering force, slumping motionless to the floor. Rin flinched at the sickening sound of cracking armor and desperate, pained shouts. The sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood instantly overwhelmed the sterile, expensive scent of the penthouse. Dax was a blur of controlled, devastating violence, tearing through the elite squad like they were made of brittle paper. He didn't just defeat them. He systematically dismantled the very forces meant to protect his throne. The pristine corridor quickly became a brutal war zone. Rin crawled backward, her trembling hand pressing against the bleeding slash on her shoulder. She watched the massacre unfold through the ruined doorway, her breath catching painfully in her throat. The tactical guards were no match for a fully shifted, enraged Alpha King protecting his recognized mate. Dax stood triumphant in the center of the hall. He was surrounded by groaning, broken bodies. His thick black fur was slick with the blood of his own loyal soldiers. He was panting heavily, his massive chest heaving with violent exertion. But the brutal fight was not over. His glowing, blood-red eyes snapped toward the terrified council members huddled at the end of the hall. The beast was completely, irrevocably, unhinged. The feral madness had taken over entirely, erasing the calculated, ruthless king and leaving only a wild, overprotective monster. He took a slow, menacing step toward Elder Silas. The old wolves backed away, their hands raised in desperate, futile surrender. He was going to kill them all. He was going to murder the governing body of Neo-Viridia, plunging the entire underground city into chaotic, bloody civil war. And he was doing it all to protect a silent, broken scavenger he had met only hours ago. The profound realization hit Rin like a physical, suffocating blow. Rin could not stay hidden in the shadows. If Dax crossed that final line, there would be no kingdom left to rule. She forced her trembling, exhausted legs to move. She dragged herself across the cold marble, her bare feet slipping dangerously on the slick, blood-stained floor. She reached the splintered threshold of the ruined doorway. The chaotic noise of the alarms and the painful groans of the fallen guards seemed to fade into a dull, distant hum. She looked at the massive, blood-soaked wolf standing mere feet from the cowering, whimpering elders. Rin pushed herself up. She leaned heavily against the broken mahogany doorframe to stay upright. Her ruined throat throbbed with a vicious, agonizing ache as she prepared to break her vow. She gathered every ounce of air in her damaged lungs, fighting through the thick, suffocating walls of her 7-year silence. The words tore at her scarred vocal cords like jagged glass. They were ragged, broken, and agonizingly quiet, but they cut through the feral madness like a master's blade. Dax, stop. Chapter 5. The two words were barely a whisper, a raspy, broken breath forced through 7 years of deliberate, suffocating silence. It was a fragile sound, entirely out of place in the war zone of the royal spire, but to the feral beast tearing apart the hallway, it was a deafening command. Dax froze. His massive, blood-soaked right paw hovered mere inches from Elder Silas's throat. The old wolf whimpered, his eyes squeezed shut in terrified anticipation of death. The killing blow never fell. The ambient temperature in the corridor shifted drastically. The suffocating toxic ozone of the Alpha's feral rage fractured. The heavy silence that followed Rin's voice was absolute. Every painful groan from the injured guards, every rhythmic pulse of the blaring alarm seemed to instantly mute. The giant black wolf slowly turned his massive head. His glowing blood-red eyes locked onto Rin. She stood in the splintered doorway, trembling violently. Her pale hand pressed against her bleeding shoulder. Her chest heaved. The metallic scent of her fresh blood mixed with the heavy copper already coating the floor. She met the monster's gaze and did not look away. The violent red in his eyes rippled. It fractured like thin ice under heavy pressure, melting rapidly back into a familiar luminous amber. A low, tragic whine tore from his broad chest. It sounded like a creature that had been hunted for 1,000 years and had finally found its sanctuary. Bones cracked. The sickening, wet sound of the physical shift echoed through the ruined hall. Dark fur rapidly receded into pale, scarred skin. Massive muscles snapped and violently reformed. Within seconds, the terrifying war god vanished. Dax knelt on the blood-stained marble in his human form. He was completely bare from the waist up. His broad back was heavily scarred and heaving with desperate, ragged breaths. He didn't look at the cowering council. He didn't look at his broken elite guards. He crawled toward Rin. He moved blindly, ignoring the sharp shards of shattered oak and broken glass, biting viciously into his bare knees. He reached her feet and collapsed forward, his massive, trembling arms wrapped tightly around the back of her knees. He buried his face against her stomach, pulling her firmly against his radiating heat. He shook. The ruthless, untouchable king of Neo-Viridia trembled like a frightened child. A harsh, broken sob ripped out of his throat, vibrating heavily against her skin. "You spoke," Dax choked out. His voice was a raw, agonizing rasp. "You spoke to me." Rin looked down at the dark, disheveled hair of the man clinging to her waist. He was a killer. He was the usurper who had stolen her throne, but right now, he was a starving man who had just been handed a lifeline. Slowly, her trembling fingers reached down. She brushed his dark hair. Dax didn't flinch. The touch-starved tyrant, whose skin violently rejected all physical contact, leaned heavily into her palm. He craved it. His wolf purred, a deep, heavy, rhythmic vibration that resonated through the floor and into her bones. A sudden movement drew Rin's eyes down the hall. Elder Silas had pushed himself cautiously to his knees. The old wolf was staring directly at Rin. More specifically, he was staring at the exposed, faded crescent moon tattoo at the base of her neck, now fully visible without the collar of her heavy jacket. Silas's wrinkled face completely drained of color. He understood. The triggered genetic alarms. The Alpha's sudden suicidal protection of a filthy lower-level scavenger. He recognized the noble bone structure buried beneath the years of grime. Silas lowered his head. He pressed his forehead directly against the bloody marble, baring his neck in absolute, undeniable submission. "My queen," Silas whispered, his voice shaking with profound awe and terror. One by one, the surviving guards dragged their broken bodies to their knees. They bowed their heads, exposing their vulnerable throats to the air. The entire royal hall knelt before the silent scavenger. Dax growled. It was a low, fiercely possessive warning. He tightened his iron grip around her waist, turning his head slightly to glare at the kneeling men. His amber eyes burned, promising immediate death if they dared to look at his mate again. "Out," Dax commanded. It was a single word, but the lethal authority in it was absolute. The elders and the broken guard scrambled backward, desperate to escape the spire before his terrifying patience snapped. The heavy, reinforced steel doors of the inner vault slid shut, sealing out the world. Dax carried Rin into the deepest, most secure chamber of the penthouse. The air here smelled of clean cedar, rich earth, and heavy, undisturbed silence. The ambient temperature was incredibly warm, heated by an unseen subterranean thermal vent. He set her down gently on a massive circular bed covered entirely in thick, dark furs. Then, the wolf took over completely. Dax moved around the dim room in a frantic, instinctual haze. He dragged heavy silk blankets from the massive mahogany armoires. He piled plush velvet pillows around the perimeter of the mattress. He was nesting. He was building an impenetrable fortress of softness and scent to protect his newly claimed mate. Rin sat in the center of the furs, watching him work. He finished barricading the edges of the bed. Then he crawled into the center with her. He brought a warm, damp cloth and a small glass jar of mint-scented healing salve. "Let me," he whispered, his amber eyes pleading for permission. His calloused fingers were agonizingly gentle. He meticulously wiped the dried blood from her collarbone. He cleaned the shallow, angry slash Vex had left on her shoulder. He applied the cooling salve, his jaw clenching with shared pain every single time she gave a tiny, involuntary flinch. He was so close. The overpowering scent of his dominance, crushed pine and electric ozone, wrapped around her like a heavy protective blanket. When the shoulder wound was fully clean, Dax did not pull away. He leaned down and pressed his warm lips to the white bandage on her shoulder. The soft kiss sent a bolt of pure electric heat straight down to Rin's toes. Then he moved his mouth upward, hovering over her throat. He kissed the jagged, ugly scar over her vocal cords. He worshipped the physical mark of her trauma. "Never again," Dax murmured against her sensitive skin, his breath hot and ragged. "You never have to hide from the world again." Rin swallowed hard. The suffocating silence of the last 7 years felt like a physical brick wall, finally crumbling inside her chest. She looked deep into his glowing amber eyes, seeing the unyielding devotion shining there. He watched them, Rin whispered. Her voice was gravelly, painfully quiet and rough. It hurt her throat to use, but the physical pain was completely eclipsed by the desperate need to finally speak the truth out loud. Dax went perfectly still. His amber eyes locked onto hers, absorbing every broken syllable. "My fated mate," Rin continued, the heavy tears finally spilling over her dark lashes. "He was a royal general. When the rebellion came, he opened the palace gates. He watched them slaughter my mother, my father. He rejected our bond to save his own life." She slowly reached up, tracing the heavy scar on her own throat. "I cut myself so I wouldn't scream, so the executioners wouldn't find me hiding under the bodies." The temperature in the vault instantly spiked. Dax's broad chest heaved. The sheer magnitude of his sudden rage was terrifying, but he kept it completely contained. He forcibly channeled the feral rising fury into absolute, unwavering devotion to the woman in front of him. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her securely onto his lap. He tucked her head safely under his chin. "He is dead," Dax stated, his voice dropping to a low, lethal vibration. "I killed the generals who opened the gates. I tore them apart for their cowardice." He pressed a fierce, deeply possessive kiss into her damp hair. "But even if he lived, he could not have you. You were never his." Dax shifted, forcing her to look up at his handsome, scarred face. His exceptionally large hands cupped her cheeks, his rough thumbs gently wiping away her falling tears. "You are mine," he declared. The heavy words were a vow, etched in stone and sealed in ancient blood. "I am the monster of Neo-Viridia. I am the ruthless tyrant, and I swear upon my life, my stolen crown, and my wolf. I will forever be your sword and your shield." Rin's dormant, terrified wolf finally answered. It surged forward in her chest, fully recognizing the ultimate protector, the true mate who would happily burn the entire world to ash just to keep her safe. She reached up, weaving her slender fingers into his dark, disheveled hair, and pressed her mouth firmly to his. Dax groaned, a desperate, starving sound of pure victory. He laid her back into the warm nest of furs, covering her small body entirely with his massive frame. The toxic shadows of the underground city completely disappeared, leaving only the burning heat of the Alpha King and the absolute suffocating romance of his endless possession.